Hey guys, how you doing? Luna here with a new video for the channel. Today I bring you a new episode of the Great Album series. This is basically a weekly series where I talk about albums I love. I introduce you guys to some new music or maybe talk about music that you already like. In the last episode, which was actually the first one, we had a theme which was modern hip-hop. In this one we don't have shit. So basically this is a Royal Rumble. Every album counts. Let's not gonna waste any more time. Let's just go on with the video. First and foremost, I want to talk about Led Zeppelin I. This is the debut album of the legendary, awesome, one of my personal favorites, Led Zeppelin. The huge influence this album caused, this was basically the blueprint for everyone who wanted to make a heavier version of rock music. It's not that they were the first one to do it, but they were the first one to make a sound that was so commercially accepted and also so heavy. You have some amazing songs in this album. You have, for example, Dazed and Confused, that amazing and dramatic and overall just so scary guitar riff in the track. It's so great. Robert Plant's vocals in this album are great no matter the track we're talking about. It is true that depending on the track they can be better or worse. For example, that last part in the track You Shook Me, where Jim Page and Robert Plant has some sort of battle between who can bring who can sing louder, basically Jim's guitar or Robert Plant's vocals. And it's weird, especially because they're not really nailing neither the chords or the vocals, so it's kind of like problematic. But it's entertaining, it's interesting, it can kind of set you off if you're in this groovy mood. The album sets you in, especially in that track. But it's good interaction between bandmates, and I believe that it's an interesting moment in the album. Even though this album is not perfect, it has quite a few issues, especially production wise. This album is still really rough in terms of production. Sometimes the vocals, the drums, and the guitar are just all over the place. You cannot tell which one's which, and that's definitely a problem, especially if you've listened to other Led Zeppelin albums, for example like Houses of the Holy or Led Zeppelin IV. You can tell that these problems are solved, and this sounds even rougher. Not only that, but you can tell in this album that they leaned pretty heavily on blues influences. It's almost like a ripoff. Maybe you can sort of be tricked into thinking that it's not such a big deal, but especially because the blues singers, or at least back in the day, the blues singers had a way lower tone. They usually sang in this way deeper voice. Instead, you listen to Robert Plant going, and you think that, oh, this is totally different. But when you actually pay attention to the track, you can tell that it's almost like exactly the same tunes. It's sort of funny looking how people react to Greta Van Fleet, thinking that, oh my god, how dare they copy one of the greatest bands ever. They could never. You should listen to this album more carefully, because it is a pretty heavily influenced album by the blues scene. But you know what? They find their own sound in the genre. They definitely twist it to the point where it sounds totally different if you're not actually listening carefully. This is also probably the most influential album in Led Zeppelin's catalog. This one or Led Zeppelin II, because Led Zeppelin IV and III were basically just perfecting the sound they invented in this album. But overall, this is an amazing album. There's some amazing tracks in here. Our Baby, I'm Gonna Leave You. Also, you have You Shook Me. You have Dazed and Confused. Communication Breakdown, one of the best and most accelerating songs that Led Zeppelin has ever given to us. This track is amazing, definitely a highlight on this album. You also have the opening track, Good Times, Bad Times. Really good song, a bit underwhelming considering the rest of the songs I've just mentioned, but overall this is just a great album. This is a really good album, one of the best releases from 1969, and even though it's not the best Led Zeppelin album, it's still a really really good introduction to the band. It's way easier to listen to this album rather than Fourth or Led Zeppelin III or Houses of the Holy or even more Physical Graffiti. So definitely, if you want to get into Led Zeppelin, listen to this album. If you like this, you're basically gonna like everything they did afterwards. So go ahead, give it a try. Then we're going to talk about Some Girls. This is a really sad story. This album is like engulfed in this, greatness, but also sadness around it, because this is the last great Rolling Stones album. The Rolling Stones tried many different genres in their career as musicians, especially in the 60s. They were kind of finding out their own style, doing R&B, blues rock, also some really heavy rock tracks, and psychedelic rock. They were trying everything. They were trying to find their own sound, even pop music actually, now that I remember, in albums like Between the Buttons. But I think that we can all agree on something. If the world can come to terms with agreeing on one single fact, is that the best thing the Rolling Stones ever did was rock and roll, to the point where I believe that if we're talking about just rock and roll, good old-fashioned rock and roll, there's no other band like the Rolling Stones. Is it Keith Richards, songwriting? Is it Mick Jagger's performance? Or is it the drumming? There was something about the Rolling Stones that just yelled rock and roll at you, and I fucking loved it. But you can only go as far and write as many rock and roll albums. Eventually, you're just gonna have to twist it. And knowing this, it was basically obvious that when they ran out of ideas of how to do rock and roll music, then that was basically the last great Rolling Stones album, and that's what this album is. This album includes some elements of disco music. We're actually only one track here. The opening track, Miss You, has a bit of a disco beat on it, but it's basically a rock song with some influences. It's a rock song that you can dance to at a club, basically. But the rest of the tracks here are just pure rock and rollers, and some amazing one. Lies, Beast of Burden is an amazing track, really interesting concept too, about how you're trying to reach the expectations of a female that you really like. You also have the track Shattered, which is, one of my favorites one from this album. You have Faraway Eyes, a really beautiful ballad, really nice chorus as well, one of my personal favorites from the Rolling Stones. In here, it's pure rock and roll, really fast-paced music. So obviously you cannot listen to this album, in all occasions. But that's not the only problem with the album. You also have some really questionable lyrics, like the anthem for stereotyping people in the track Some Girls, where basically Mick Jagger and Keith Richards come up with lines like, black girls just like to be fucked all night and I just don't have enough jam. This track basically grabs all of the different races that a female can have and stereotypes them. Like literally that's the whole track. I'm putting some examples here so you can see. Questionable track, and it's not even that great of a melody nor the production. That's another issue with the album. The production in some songs it's a bit low. I know I'm saying a lot of bad things, but this is actually a great album. I'm just pointing out these things because the Rolling Stones used this sound and did better things with this sound earlier in the 70s, but this is still a great album from 1978, and we're talking about a really good year for music, so that kind of tells you how good this album is. Give it a try if you're a Rolling Stones fan looking for new material. This album is a bit underrated inside their own discography, so go ahead, give this one a try. Now we're going with McCartney. This is the first album released by Sir Paul McCartney outside of the Beatles, a self-titled homemade studio album, the first one out of a trilogy, or at least for now, a trilogy. This album, even though I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are gonna be like, what the fuck, what is this album doing in the great album series? Well, basically, I just love this album for whatever reason. That's the reason why I wanted to add it here. I don't have many opportunities to express my love for this album, so I thought, what? One of the good things of having a channel of your own, even if no one watches the videos, is that you can actually talk about the things that you like. You don't have to wait for other people to enjoy it as well. A few good things I can say about this album is that, first of all, you're listening to someone finding his own sound. Outside of the Beatles, it's not an easy thing after you've been in probably the greatest band ever to find your own sound, try to reach the expectations of thousands, millions of fans trying to see what you're gonna do next. This is just Paul saying, okay, I'm figuring things out. This is the style that I'm going with right now. A lot of the material here is recycled from the Let It Be and Abbey Road sessions, and some material even from the White Album sessions, like Junk, for example, and Maybe I'm Amazed. There are a lot of instrumentals here. There are a lot of tracks that seem to be unfinished. Actually, most of the tracks here seem to be unfinished. The production is pretty rough too. This is a homemade album, album too. So recording, producing, vocals, instruments, everything is quoted to Paul and Linda McCartney. Try to listen to this album with no expectations. Listen to tunes like Junk, Man We Was Lonely, Maybe I'm Amazed. All of them are great songs, and people just seem to judge this album based on how much of a disappointment it was after, the Beatles were releasing their best albums like the White Album, the Sgt. Pepper's, Abbey Road. But listen to me, basically this is just a bunch of rock and roll, some folky tunes here and there, some power ballads like the mentioned before, Maybe I'm Amazed, which is arguably the best track on this album or in Paul's entire discography. The vocal performances in many of the songs here are quite diverse. You go from melodic Paul McCartney in Junk and Man We Was Lonely, then he goes out hard, for example, in the track Ooh You, and he goes hard but also at the same time melodic in tracks like Maybe I'm Amazed and Every Night. So you have a lot of things to play around with in terms of sound. It's really interesting listening to albums like Band on the Run, Wildlife, and Ram, knowing that everything started with this album, with the ideas he had here. So I guess that, the how rough the production is in this album kind of helps the album be, in the concept that it is, being the first album of someone who just wants to make a record, to try and find his own sound. It's perfectly fit for it. I'm not saying that this album is one of the most groundbreaking and one of the most impressive releases of all time, nor the 70s, nor 1970 only, but I'm just trying to tell you that there are not many albums as this one. There are not many records so personal and intimate, from the musical point of view, because there's not any intimate themes played in this album, but from the musical point of view, from the point of view of a musician, of someone who's trying to know how music works, there's not many albums like this. So I know that a lot of people are going to go at me saying that this album is actually quite shit, but I argue against it. I really like this album. Junk, Every Night, Man We Was Lonely, Teddy Boy. So go ahead, give this album a try. Let me know what you think. This album is really underrated. A lot of people just fucking hate this album because of how much of a disappointment it was and everything that was going on. Everything that was going on at the time with the Beatles, Paul McCartney suing the Beatles and the Beatles suing Paul McCartney. It was a fucking mess. The whole band was a mess at this point, but you can't really tell. This album is pretty laid back. There's nothing that aggressive about this, so go ahead, give it a try. In this video we've talked about Paul McCartney, which is one of the greatest songwriters of all time. We've talked about Led Zeppelin, one of the most influential bands ever. And we've talked about the Rolling Stones, which probably have the best catalog in terms of rock and roll music and, overall the 70s. So putting Billie Eilish in the same video doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but I wanted to make sure of how random these videos are usually going to be when I have no theme on them, okay? So I do believe that this is an amazing album and an album that is at the same level as the ones I've mentioned before, and I'm about to explain why. People like to throw a lot of shit to Billie Eilish for some fucking reason, which I don't know which one it is. I think that she is an amazing, talented, and beautiful artist. It's not that being beautiful does anything for the music, but I think it's just worth noting that the woman is quite, she's quite a treasure. A lot of people seem to complain about her breathy vocals, the production being a bit too minimalistic. There's nothing that groundbreaking about anything that Billie Eilish has done up to this point. And actually the things that go a little bit too hard, for example, like Happier Than Ever, in her new album, are a bit, sound weird, like she's not comfortable in this sound. I definitely do prefer albums like this, where she's singing way more quietly. The production seems to go around, around her voice really well. There's nothing that much going on in the instrumentals. And also the production in this album is way better than any other album I've talked about in this video. Props to Phineas and Billy for the production on this album is amazing. The recordings are amazing. You can almost tell every single breath that's coming out of Billy's mouth. And sometimes that can be a little bit too invading your privacy. But most of the times, it just kind of helps you see every little bit of emotion that Billy tries to portray in the songs, especially because every single song here, it's really emotional. There's not like a funny song or a goofy song. Maybe you can say The Bad Guy, it kind of is, but apart from that song, everything here, Sandy, When the Party's Over, I Love You, I Wish You Were Gay, every song here has some sort of emotional content in it, and this breathy vocals, this gloomy, sort of dark atmosphere that the album has throughout the whole listen helps that. Also, you know, Billie Eilish harmonizing with herself is one of the most beautiful things I've heard in my entire life. A few things that I can say about this album that I didn't like, though, is first of all the lyrics. I think that sometimes is a bit too dramatic. Honestly, I understand that we're listening to a 17-year-old girl at this point, but still, even to that age, some of the things I hear here are not really relatable for me. And you know, I'm really young too. I'm 21 years old. I'm not an old person talking. I'm a young guy. I'm a teenager, and I don't find any of the things said in this album relatable. Especially when we're going around saying things like "tore my shirt to stop your bleeding." I mean, is this literally? And if not, what the fuck is it that you mean? Or do you mean that you were kind of sacrificing your own goods to try and help this person? I don't understand why are you doing this so early in your life. And actually, the only reason why I kind of thing that fits well into the album is because of the performance, which again, props to the performance by Billie. It's not easy to communicate that much emotion by singing in such a low register, such a low tune, such a low volume. Another thing that I don't really like about this album is that you can only go as far in terms of songwriting with one style, and I think that Billie abused this dark, quiet style that she used in this album way too much, because by the end I feel like she ran out of ideas, and the fact that the last song on this album is sort of like a mashup of all the different songs to kind of support our argument. The album has a lot of beautiful things for you to focus on in order to, you know, forget about the lyrics, so I think it's not that big of a deal. I think this is a great album. I think that this is one of the best releases from 2018, and it was a really good year, and I think it's a great album to close up this new episode of Great Albums. So that is it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. I really hope that enjoyed this one. I really hope to see you in the comments telling me which one is your favorite out of the 4 albums I've talked about in this video. With that being said, once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you guys soon with another video. But until then, bye.